The Book of Esther. Now, this is an unusual one. It's a single story all the way through, front to end, front to back. It's very there are very few books of the Bible that are like that. Most of the historical or story-based books of the Bible are episodic. One piece, then another piece, then another piece, like the Samuel and Kings and Chronicles books. Um, Same with Ezra and Nehemiah. Really, Esther is in a category almost by itself. Just that and Ruth are pretty much the only books with a single, definite, continual story that occupies the whole book. So that's pretty fun. That makes Esther one of the more popular, I guess, one of the more popular and accessible books of the Old Testament. And despite that, though, there's a bit of a debate in scholarly circles surrounding exactly what kind of literature it is. What kind of story is it? And this ties in a lot to do with, the author is unknown, and the date of origin when it was written down is also unknown. So all these questions kind of link together. Some of the theories out there is that it's basically a Greek comedy written in Hebrew. Others, that's more of a later date theory, like 2nd century BC, perhaps. There's also a theory that it's more of a Persian romance. And others, with perhaps a more simplistic approach to assessing it, will say, well, it's a historical account written by the Hebrews shortly after it happened, possibly by Mordecai himself. So we have a range of possibilities on what this book is and where it comes from. Most of the debate about this is centered around the content of the book, quite rightfully and quite reasonably. So the reason that I mentioned the Greek comedy and the Persian romance is because of the rather bombastic nature of this story. It's easy to miss, especially if you're used to the children's Sunday school version of the story, or you don't actually read it from the Bible very carefully, or you'd read it too seriously. If you look at it and take it on its own terms, it's actually kind of a funny story. You've got the Haman, the melodramatic comic book villain. He is such a wild guy. He gets so upset over such trivialities. Mordecai won't salute me in the street. I'm going to kill him. And I'm going to get the king to make this thing. It's really, really funny. It doesn't take much imagination to see this, 1950s, 60s pulp fiction sort of stereotype guy. It's really fun. And along with that is King Ahasuerus himself. He's also a kind of a laughable character. He cannot do anything. He always has to ask someone else, what am I supposed to do? My wife won't come to the banquet. What should I do? You should divorce her. Okay. Haman wants to kill all the Jews in my kingdom. Is that a good idea? Yes. Okay. My wife says I shouldn't. Okay, I won't. There is a biblical value to seeking advice and counsel for, when you're in charge of things, but his impotence is hilarious. And this actually might be a bit of a historical connection to known history outside of this book, because depending on who exactly we understand Ahasuerus to be, there's a good chance that he was the Persian king that failed to invade Greece. So he runs off west, fights in all these wars, and comes home with nothing to show for it. So he's already kind of a ineffectual leader in that sense. So to play that up in this story might make a lot of sense. And then a different type of stereotype. You've got Mordecai. He's the wise mentor figure in the background. He's always doing the right thing, and he gives Esther all the right advice, and he has taken her in, adopting her as his own daughter, even though he's an uncle, I believe. So there's that character. And then in the center of the whole story, of course, is Esther herself. And she's the hero of the day, or the heroine of the story. And she has to agonize over the difficult decisions. Do I confront my husband, the king, and at risk of my life to attempt to save my people from destruction? What do I do? So she is the only developed character in this story. Everyone else is pretty flat and one-dimensional. Mordecai is wise. Ahasuerus is impotent. Haman is ridiculous. But Esther is actually kind of a formed character. You get to know something about her. The challenge of getting to know Esther, however, is that when you look at the history of the Bible, we have a tale of two Esthers. I've mentioned this in a different video, but the Greek Old Testament and the Hebrew Old Testament give us very different books of Esther. Most of the time, the Greek Old Testament, or Septuagint, is just a slightly different version or translation of the Hebrew scriptures. And you can get a few word differences here and there that don't immediately make sense when you go from Hebrew to Greek. But Esther is one of the two books that is substantially different. There are whole sections added to this book in Greek compared to the Hebrew version. And it's even though that wording is difficult, we can't necessarily say that it's been added in the Greek version because we don't know if the Hebrew version from which the Greek version was translated is older or newer than the Hebrew version that we have today. It's almost a 50-50 call on this, as in terms of which one is more ancient, closer to the original. The Dead Sea Scrolls would have been a game changer for us in terms of identifying which manuscript tradition is the older one, but unfortunately none of the Dead Sea Scrolls have really given us anything about Esther so far. So that was kind of a drag. So for all the things that area of scholarship has resolved, or at least helped, it hasn't really helped the situation with the Book of Esther. So, a tale of two Esthers. In the Hebrew version of Esther, she comes across as what you might call a secular Jew. She is aware of her Jewish upbringing, of course, and she's aware of the way of life, but it's kind of invisible. She doesn't bring it up, and there's no sign of any religious piety on her part at all. You may be familiar with the piece of trivia that the Book of Esther, at least in the Protestant Bible from the Hebrew version, is the only book in the Bible that does not mention God. Of course he's there, but he's never named or mentioned directly. And that's reflected in the character of Esther in the Hebrew version. She is basically going through a conversion experience. She is being prompted by Mordecai, make a stand for your people. Serve your God instead of the king. Let's save God's people here. But of course, if you don't do it, God will raise someone else up instead. Then you get to the Greek version of this book, and Esther is a very different person. She is very pious. We hear most of the editions or sections that are in the Greek version that aren't in the Hebrew version are prayers or letters written by various characters or spoken by various characters. We get, I think, two different prayers from Esther, which both just really demonstrate her piety, how much she despises the Persian fineries that she wears, and how in private she doesn't wear her queenly things and just is in sackcloth and ashes weeping for her people and wishing she could be reunited. So she's a very, very pious young lady, and it's more of a personal conviction story that she makes the right decision with Mordecai's help, as opposed to wholesale converting from religious indecision to a commitment to God. And so that brings us back to the question of authorship and origin. The book of Esther is in different places in the Greek and Hebrew versions of the Bible, of the Old Testament. In the Hebrew, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, Esther is not in the historical books section. In fact, the Tanakh doesn't even have a history section, technically. It has Torah, prophets, and writings. And Esther is in the writings. It's the tertiary level of Hebrew scripture. You can see another video about layers of biblical canon that I deal with this as well in that. But the idea in the Hebrew scriptures is that Esther is this almost extra book of the Bible. It's just sort of there. It's tied to a particular holiday, and it's not a regular mainstream part of the scriptures as such. Whereas in the Greek Old Testament, which was popular among Jews and Christians in the final century before and following Christ, Esther is in a different spot. It's along Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles with Kings and Samuel and Joshua and Judges. So it's actually part of this historical book's succession. So there, Esther is treated as a history as opposed to a story. So there might be an implication that whoever arranged the Greek Old Testament considered Esther more of an historical writing as opposed to just some story with, whether it's a morality tale based on history or completely made up or some mixture, I don't know. So all these different possibilities and, the way that it's put into the biblical canon helps reflect what the arranger believes about the book. And again, we don't know who wrote it. We don't know exactly when it got written down. And so you have to put all of this together, all this evidence about the style of the writing and the language and, the quality of the Hebrew and how many words are borrowed from Greek or Persian languages. So all this together, it's a very interesting book, and its purpose, its place in the canon is a little different depending on which Old Testament you look at, and the nature of its historical accuracy is very much up for grabs. Certainly, this book has a lot of exaggeration. It's very melodramatic. The characters, as I already mentioned, are very one-dimensional, very melodramatic or impotent or wise. Here, Esther is the only believable person in the book. And, the gallows that Haman has built for Mordecai, which then the king gets Haman hanged from, is insanely tall when you read it in cubits. It's like, oh, well, what the heck is a cubit? But it's hundreds of feet high, which is ridiculous. It's bigger than the bloody palace, for goodness sake. So that's just weird. And the period of time dedicated for Esther's beauty treatments at the beginning when she's auditioning to become queen, so to speak, is also odd. And the length of the feast that the king is having is also unreasonable. So it's just, everything is really big and grandiose and melodramatic and exciting. So we're not able to tell where the real history is. And so we have to ask the question, what is the purpose of this book in the canon? Well, for the Jewish community, we can see this in the Tanakh because it's in the writings instead of the prophets. The canonical purpose of the book of Esther was that it should have a symbiotic relationship with the festival of Purim. That's a holiday in the Jewish calendar. It still is. It's kind of like they call it Jewish Halloween sometimes because that's when the kids dress up in costumes and making fun of Haman and all the scary things that have threatened them over the course of history and that God has helped them overcome. But anyway, the book of Esther exists to establish the purpose for Purim. And at the same time, the festival of Purim is the time that the book of Esther is read. So they kind of exist for each other. It's not it doesn't really comment on other parts of the Bible as such, and no other parts of the Bible really contribute to the book of Esther either. So it's really tied to this holiday. So then, as Christians, how do we receive this book from the Jewish writings into the Christian Bible? Because we don't celebrate Purim. We celebrate Easter, when Jesus saved the world from sin, which is a much bigger deal than any local or momentary salvation from worldly threat. So we don't celebrate Purim. We celebrate Easter and Christian holidays. But what this book does do is give us an example of how to create a holiday, so to speak. When a big event in a community takes place, it is good and appropriate, and even a godly thing, to institute a memorial of that event, to remember it on its anniversary from year to year. Much of the Christian calendar is based on Jewish precedent, but this story gives us a picture of that principle at work, in how a new feast can be invented, but made to commemorate a good thing. And so that feeds into binding the unity or strengthening the unity of the community of the people of God. And that's the other big, big, big lesson in this book, the importance of ecclesial community. Esther had to be loyal to her people, to help protect them, do her part to try and rescue them. And she put herself at risk by doing that, because she could have fallen prey to the same law that Haman had passed. So the importance of solidarity within the community of the people of God, certainly as the church, this is something that has come up throughout history as being very important. It's very easy for us Americans today to disassociate ourselves from the church or from certain strands of Christianity and say, well, yeah, they're a bunch of haters over there because they don't like gay people, or they're phobic of this, that, and the other thing, and racist and whatever. All the issues that we face in one place, one way or another. It's very easy to distance ourselves, but the importance of banding together as God's people, and the fact that we stand and fall together and we need to be the body of Christ, is a very, very important lesson, which we can actually learn about from the book of Esther. I actually had the pleasure of preaching through this book a couple years ago, well, more than a couple years now, but that was one of the big lessons that I found coming up over and over again throughout, is that the solidarity, the importance of being God's people as we have been called to be. So anyway, that's the book of Esther. Lovely little book, and I hope you enjoy giving it a reread in the near future. God bless.